Good evening, everyone. My name is Noah Rauch. I'm the Senior Vice President for Education and Public Programs here at the 9/11 Memorial Museum. I want to welcome you all. Thank you all for coming, and welcome everyone who's joining on our live web broadcast. In the aftermath of 9/11, 1.8 million tons of debris filled this 16-acre site. 0.2% of those remains would be transferred to Hangar 17, an empty 80,000 square foot hangar at JFK Airport. The artifacts that filled that space, steel, pieces of the antenna that sat atop the North Tower, crushed vehicles, mangled sculptures, remnants of the stores that filled the mall at the World Trade Center, they had been saved as documentation of what had happened here on 9/11. To tell this story in the future, whenever that would be, those tasked with leading this effort knew that we would need artifacts. In the words of our favorite fictional archaeologist, this belongs in a museum. Indeed, you can see many of the objects downstairs. Many others found their way to memorial sites around the world, and no matter where they ended up, all connect us to what happened here. So to help us understand how this happened, how debris became artifacts, and the central role of Hangar 17 in that process, we're joined by three individuals who are instrumental in this work. Amory Houghton is a former senior strategic planner for the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. During his time with the Port Authority, he started and ran the World Trade Center Artifact Restoration Program. Steve Weintraub is the founder and principal of Art Preservation Services. In 2002, the Port Authority brought him on as a consultant for the preservation of World Trade Center artifacts. He then served as conservation consultant here at the museum in advance of our opening in 2014. And finally, Mark Wagner served as project architect at Ground Zero, where he was tasked with helping select and preserve artifacts from the site immediately following 9/11. He then went on to serve as project architect and designer for the 9/11 Memorial Museum. I should say, as an aside, Mark's been incredibly generous with his time over the years with our staff and our volunteers to help us understand the choices that were made with the design of the museum. And so that generosity continues tonight, as it does with all of our speakers. So thank you all for joining us this evening. Please join me in welcoming Amory, Mark, and Steve in conversation with our director, Clifford Chanin.
Thank you, Noah, and welcome everybody. I was saying before, as the program begins to wind up, I begin to prepare. And doing so really brought me back and remembered how much this has been one of my favorite subjects in all the time I've been spending at the museum. I really, from the very beginning, was absolutely fascinated by how this came together in the middle of absolute chaos and destruction, which meant someone was thinking about the future, which meant someone was having to sort the unsortable and make some decisions and preserve these elements that would be saved for the museum. And so even before there was a museum. And so the three panelists tonight are three of the key people who made that happen. And it really has been just a source of great fascination for me. I will remind, and you can buy these afterwards. These are the remnant copies of the catalog that we made for the 10th anniversary exhibition, which were the photographs of Hangar 17. We decided at one point we were going to document this because we knew it was going to disappear at some point. And it was really one of the most remarkable experiences being in there, particularly being in there on your own, which I certainly had the occasion to do occasionally. But these gentlemen, I think, would have had that experience frequently. How do you get there, Mark? And Mark Wagner is the first person who begins the journey of this material. Mark is a young architect working for Hangar Associates, an architectural firm that had a relationship with the Port Authority. And Mark, pick up the story. Hangar gets a call after 9/11, immediately after.
Yeah,
what do they want you to do?
They didn't know what they wanted me to do, right? So the first call from the chief architect of the Port Authority said, I need to know what I lost, right? He's like, the towers, the Trade Center was my home, and I can't bring myself to go back and see it myself right now, and I can't ask any of my team to go back to the site and see it. He said, would you? Okay. Right?
Yes, sir.
I said yes, right? I mean, the reality is there were two things going on at the time, I think personally, is that, we all wanted to help somehow, but we didn't know how. We didn't know what to do. So any chance I could get to take part in this, I was going to say yes, whether that was volunteering or this, going down and just reporting back. The other part of it is I had to see it to believe it. Right? I've been watching it just like everybody else on the news for days. I was in Manhattan the day that it all came down, but still, seeing the dust cloud and seeing the pile are two very different things. So I agreed to do it. And later that night when I got back, exhausted by the experience emotionally and physically, I wrote a short memo back to Bob, and I said, Bob Davidson was the name of the chief architect. And I said, well, there's nothing really left, right? I had friends ask me, well, was it a pile of furniture? Was it a pile of computers? Was it a pile? No, it was dirt, right? It was pulverized, everything, except the large elements of steel. And on the pile, I saw the Koenig sphere in the center. And so in this memo back to Bob, trying to explain what I had seen, I said, I don't know if you want to save that, right? Because I think about probably all of our, hopefully we don't have the same experience or we don't have this experience ever in our lives, but think about it. If your home is flooded or your home is on fire, everybody says, I'm going to go in and I'm going to get something. I'm going to take something to remember what I've lost. Mm. So I wrote this memo, and I don't forget, there were 4 or 5 bullet points on it. I said, do you want the Koenig sphere? I knew that the Port Authority had an extensive public art collection. I said, maybe some other art pieces are there somewhere in the debris. Maybe we'll find that. Maybe from the architect side, I said, do you want a sample of materials? Do you want to get some of the travertine or some of the steel and some of the pieces that, the way architects would put together a materials board to present materials to a client? Would you try to take any of that? Because all of these objects have a meaning and they trigger memories in us, right? It all brings you back to a specific point. So it was a short memo, and Bob said, yes, that's a great idea. And so then for the remainder, and this was about a week after September 11th when this call came through and when I started this process, then through the full period of cleanup, I was on site selecting artifacts that had some meaning, whether it was something that was triggering an emotion in me, whether it was something that reminded me of the past, whether it was something that once the exercise became a little bit more understood by the crews working the site, I'd have other people coming up to me and saying, I saw something that might be of interest for this collection that you're putting together. So it became a very collective collection.
So much about anything connected to 9/11 is a collective response. Yeah. Amory, you were already working for the Port Authority. This is not an area that the Port Authority was planning on being involved in, preserving the remnants of these collapsed buildings. So take us inside the port. The port lost 84 people on 9/11, including 37 Port Authority police officers.
Including the executive director.
Including the executive director. So the organization is under shock and grief and suffering through this, and yet there seems to be an awareness within the Port Authority that something needs to be done for the benefit of history.
Yeah, I think it wasn't clear what that role would be early on. I mean, everybody at the port was kind of scrambling to get back, make the airports open, make the ports open, make the bridges safe, make what we used to do doable. And I think Bob and Chris Ward, who was my immediate boss, and later the head of the Port Authority, was one of the first people in the management level to say this is something that we have to think about. And the original idea was to take some of the steel and put it in the warehouses on the Brooklyn Pier, which we quickly shot down because we thought that the weight would collapse the piers. But most of the effort was initially how do we return the functions of the port to normal, and then that process happened later. And Mark is was really the star of the whole thing, and Bob's associate Jackie Hanley was really, really helpful with that. And then we ultimately sent a lot of stuff out to Kennedy Airport, and basically just dumped it there because they didn't know what else to do with it. They had to get it off the site.
Tell us about Hangar 17, how that comes.
Hangar 17,
which is an empty building at that point.
Well, yeah, it was an empty building. Hangar 17 was built in, I think, either the late 1950s or the early 1950s.
And let me just ask, we can pull up photo 1 so you can see what it looked like at the time, or roughly the time. Yeah.
Right, that very handsome building there was originally built by Pan Am, and there were 2 hangars of 80,000 square feet and a spine down the middle. And one of the reasons why we chose it is because there were no columns in it. We looked at several other hangars around there, but picked that one. The problem was that in the intervening half decade or so, that tower had evacuated the hangar. The pigeons and the feral cats had moved in. So there was literally a half an inch of pigeon shit on the floor. And it was pretty awful, as you remember.
It was pretty awful.
It was pretty awful. It was pretty awful. But for the longest time, the area where you see the word tower there, the immediate area to the left is where the initial portion of the steel came, and it was just left outside for the entire winter of 2001, 2002, and then I got involved, and I can't really remember how I got involved. I mean, I was talking to Chris, and I said, this is something that we ought to do. He said, okay, well, why don't you help? And then we ultimately tried to move the steel from the outside to the inside and discovered that the doors didn't work. So remember, we had to jerry-rig one door, and then we're able to start to move stuff in.
And Steve, your own career in conservation was not oriented towards collapsed building elements. This is now becoming a collection of some sort. When do you come on the scene, and what are you brought in to do?
I got a call late spring, I think of 2002, from Bart Sanger, and he had got my name from the curators of the Metropolitan Museum, and they basically wanted some advice about what to do with the objects in order to preserve them. So it was just kind of an open question, and if I could come out there to take a look. And I'll never forget when went out, and the Port Authority police car was driving me around to the view that you're seeing there, with the tower there, where the doors are. And as Maury said, everything was outside. And in fact, you had not only the piles of steel, but I remember like the fire trucks, and they were sort of surrounding like that. Right. And it looked like something out of an old Western, with the stagecoaches and so on. And it was like, whew. And it was amazing because the way the Port Authority police car was going around, you don't see anything. And then all of a sudden,
bang,
bang, it's there. I actually remembered Tower Air because I was doing some work years before going to Europe, and they had the cheapest flights. So I'd actually been in that building, so it was definitely a strange experience. So the long and short of it is kind of like Mark was told, well, just do something, whatever. Same thing, Maury, it's like, okay, where do you start? The first thing was that because everything had contamination on it, so the intent was that everything should be cleaned to some extent before it goes into the hangar. And so therefore they weren't rushing to put everything in right away.
Right.
And it was really, a question of, let's plan something and where to start. Just to back up a little bit, though, since most of my experience in conservation, not only in treatment, but my specialty became how to preserve museum collections. And I had, in the course of things, also worked on the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. When they were building that. So I actually had dealt with artifacts as opposed to fine arts. So it was kind of this again, but in my lifetime. So there was a similarity and a big difference. And so that was kind of, I brought that to the table in my experience. And that's kind of how it got started. And then I met with Mark. Originally, I was just there really to just give some advice. And then I guess they couldn't find anybody else, or I don't know why, but they just asked me to come back again, and there it was.
Mark, the sense of responsibility for this, it seems, grows over time. Do you remember a moment where you realized, wait a minute, we have a collection here and we have to do something with it that we hadn't anticipated before? Or was it always in your mind going to get to the stage where everything was properly cared for and protected?
I think it was, I wasn't trained to do this, right? I'm an architect. I definitely wasn't trained to understand what a collection is and what it took to maintain a collection or preserve, right? So it was definitely something that we grew into, right? The more objects that I was spray painting save on, or putting these ridiculous yellow tags on to save for this unknown collection. It was like hold, I think was what the sign said. Right. Hold for a Port Authority archive, right? We didn't know where it was going at the time. I remember meeting with the real estate people, and that was the oddest house shopping I've ever done. Well, what kind of space are you looking for? I don't know. How much space do you need? I don't know. How much do you have to spend? I don't know. So it was a very, there was a big learning curve, but a fast learning curve, because it was all moving very quickly. And as Maury said, right, the real pressure to preserve things was that the site was being cleared. Truckload every day. Yeah. So the reality was, if we weren't saving things right then, right away, it was going to be lost.
Yep. And so several things were.
Yeah, and some things were.
Yeah.
That was a part of it that, as much as we tagged something, if we tagged, 10 vehicles, first responder vehicles that day, we'd come back the next day and they were all gone. Yep. We'd have to re-tag 10 because they just got moved. So it was like I said, a big learning curve to figure out what we would do. But we weren't really thinking too far down the road. We were really just trying to triage. Let's get the artifact. Let's get it someplace. Okay, now we've got a hangar. Now we have to we redid the electrical in the building. We had to fix those doors, as you mentioned. There were a lot of things that just took step by step. Right. And then realizing that, wait a second, the last column, I think, was the one that really triggered needing conservation, right? Because here's this, artifact with ephemera on it, with mass cards, with notes, with handwriting, with all kinds of things on the surface, and the surface of the steel is crumbling before our eyes. So what do? We call Steve.
Well, we're gonna get to the last comment in a minute, but Maury, at some point the Port Authority is investing real money in creating this place.
Yes, and Steve mentioned the fact that we were concerned that when the trade centers were built, some of the lower floors had asbestos on them. Now, most of that was taken off, but we weren't sure what it was. So we started to clean those things just for everybody's safety. And I remember one of the lawyers came out and took a look at it, and he said, "What the hell are you doing?" And I said, "Well, we're cleaning this thing of asbestos." And he said, "You can't touch those things because they're evidence in the trial of who was responsible for the collapse." So that was a hard stop for us for a long time. So a lot of those objects stayed out there much longer than they could. And then we ultimately started to bring them in because I just got angry that these things were outside. So we had this enormous forklift come and bring these things inside. And then more steel arrived, in which we had to bring in. But the second issue was the next hurdle was the question of who actually owns this steel. Does the port own it? Well, no. because there's been a lease. So does the leaseholder own it? Well, maybe not, because they've gotten a huge insurance settlement. So does the insurance company own the steel? So we had to go through all of these different levels to try to actually do the work to restore the steel. And the port had a lot of different things on their calendar, and this was not their most pressing issue. So when the lawyers told us to stop, and the lawyers were great, by the way, at the port, they couldn't have been more helpful generally. It was a real problem because we had all of these things that we needed to take care of, and we were told not to touch them. But ultimately, we prevailed on them that these things are starting to collapse. It's really important that we get them inside and let Steve and his team could go to work trying to fix them, which is when we started to build the enclosures.
So the scene is, starting from, as you've heard, an abandoned, broken down airline hangar and steel strewn around, vehicles strewn around, and then ultimately the migration of this material inside. So it becomes, if you look at photo 4, which is going to come up here, remember this is 80,000 square feet, and things begin accumulating and things begin taking on an order. And so we get to photo 2 here, and you can see what the actual floor plan of the place became.
Right.
So this was really extraordinarily well organized. But not only that, you're not talking about normal museum objects that a curator or two can pick up and carry from place to place.
Right.
So that if you go to photo 3, you're going to see these heavy steel columns, which are perfectly organized and arrayed, one on top of the other. Everything has to be moved with heavy equipment. So, Mark, we'll get to the last column next, but the organization of this choreography of multi-ton objects is, in part, the way in which this gets created as an ordered place.
I guess first we were taking a look at the different types of artifacts. Right? Is it a piece of the tower steel? Is it a vehicle? Is it, so we were able to start kind of categorizing different things and then understanding how to bring them in. We only knew, I think, at that point, the limitations of getting things in, right? There's a certain way. We were taking some things in with a crane at the very beginning, but the crane could only reach so far into the space. So there are all these odd design or planning restrictions. Certain steel could only go so deep into the space. Other steel had to be grouped with its like partner, like you see here, the facade steel stacked. Looking at, we could have used the full 2 sides of the hangar, but that was never really a thought for us. We really just wanted to keep everything in the 80,000 square foot. We had another 80 if we really needed it.
Yeah.
But we were hoping that we can get everything in, and then organizing it in a way that one, it had to be cataloged, numbered, photographed, measured, because once you stack it, you have limited access to these things. So we were looking for, some of the steel had stamps from the fabrication, which was an indication of where in the building it was part of the erection sequence, where it was in the building. So we had to kind of inspect things looking for that type of physical evidence before it went in and got ordered. And then obviously we have to put it all into a hangar that meets egress requirements and things like that. If we're having to get out of the building fast, we had to have clear paths, which you could start seeing in the photos and in the floor plan drawing previous to this, the yellow markers. We were really kind of mapping out the space. Again, not really thinking about visitors to the space, although at this point, by the time we were getting into the hangar, there was enough understanding that the collection was coming together, so there was a lot of interest to come see it.
Right.
But it was not open to the public, but we still had to provide the safety and organization.
So one of the most critical elements, which many in the audience will know downstairs in the museum, is the last column. And it has been, and we're working backwards now, it has been conserved and stabilized to the point where it can be indefinitely out in the light and the air. This was not the case when the last column arrived. And of course, This is an extraordinarily important symbolic object that was the last thing removed from the site in the kind of funeral procession that was created at the end of the 9 month of cleanup that brought this off and all the workers off behind it for the last time. And it gets out to the hangar in the spring, the late spring, I guess, of 2002. And Steve, you come on the scene at some point related to this, but looking around, you see this and, you know, you had to take, and we can go to number 5, this has to be handled in a very particular way. Mark has described the problem of the surface and what was happening to the surface of it. So take us through the conservation challenge of the last column.
Oh my. My introduction to the last column, so you had the hangar where all the artifacts were,
Right.
but there's a matching wing on the other side,
Right.
which didn't have any artifacts in it except for the last column.
For a while.
So that's where it originally was, not in the shack that you see there. And I had only been at the hangar maybe twice, always with Mark, you know, just walking through, just talking about, well, where do you start? What do you do? You know, he walked me to the back and showed me where the last column was, so that was it. And then all of a sudden I get a call one late afternoon, as I recall, from Mark and said, oh, tomorrow we need you at the hangar. It's like 6:30 or something in the morning. Why? Oh, because the riggers are coming to move the last column. Oh.
It was probably not as calm as that. I was probably, no, the riggers are coming tomorrow. Right?
And it's
We
like,
need you there.
first off, I'd never been at the hangar without Mark. And secondly, I'd only been there a couple of days, and you know, and I didn't even know, you know, other people at the Port Authority. And he said, just be there and see what you can do. You know, so I got there, and then one of the people that I recognized from the Port Authority, fortunately, was there, but otherwise it was just the riggers. And, you know, when you have this big piece, you know, and you had these belt straps and you're supposed to pick it up. And of course, if you ever seen, you know, how riggers work, they try and find the right point of balance, but you never know until you start to do the pick. And a lot of time, you know, it'll find itself, you know, how to balance. And so I'm watching them starting to set this up, and I was explaining, before you do that, there's all these artifacts on the last column, not to mention the surface of it. And they said, well, we don't care. We're going to be moving it like right now. And so I explained to them, I've certainly been involved with rigging of things and you know, for art objects and so on, and understanding when you pick it up and things slide around. So I said, well, show me exactly where the straps are going to go, so at least I can remove those artifacts, because they were in a rush to get this thing done. And they said, well, we're going to start them here, but you know, who knows? You know, we're just going to do it. And so then I basically said, well, give me a few minutes, and I wound up having to just literally take everything off that I could that was anywhere, even remotely near where the straps were, just put them in a pile. And then they, fortunately, there was, the Port Authority person was good in terms of, he had to convince them to slow down so I could even do that. They didn't even want to wait. And so we got that done, and then finally it did get moved. So that was my introduction to it, and I'll never forget, because the was on the last column now, that the frame picture. I remember taking the rest of the stuff I left there in a box, and that I remember taking on a subway back home.
Well, see, I didn't even know that.
Yeah. So that's how it started. And then because it was so fragile, then the concern was that it needed an enclosure. So that was the first discussion, actually, of starting about enclosures in general. And it was not realistic to enclose everything. But the last column obviously had a priority. And so therefore, we wound up building this wooden shack that had the last column.
Actually, I think there was a shack before this,
Yeah, there was something.
and there was no humidity control in it.
Yeah.
And so the precariousness of the column got worse.
Yeah, it was just a very temporary thing that they had rigged up.
But I want to point out, because this shack here is the final result of all of the earth.
Right.
So you have it climate controlled. You have a cradle that's been built to hold it off of the ground.
Right.
You have mirrors underneath, so the inscriptions on the underside can be seen and accessed.
Right.
And the fragility, nonetheless, Steve, is really then the concern of what's going to happen.
So once we finally got the new space built and we stabilized at least the climate in there, but then we could look at it more carefully. And the problem was that you had a lot of exfoliation. So what happens is typically when you deal with steel, it'll get a rust layer, obviously, but the first layer that you often get is a very dense skin, and then you would get so when the rust was occurring in this high humidity, it was actually not the dense skin of iron oxide. It was between the skin and the fresh iron, and that's what was rusting, and therefore it was pushing everything off. So the very top of the column with the PAPD and the NY, all that was coming off. There was one piece that literally was this big that was just hanging there, and another big piece was actually on the ground. So that's how we started with that was removing all the paper artifacts that were put on there.
After we photographed.
Yeah, I mean, it was documented where everything was. But then it was like, now what do you do? Yes, certainly, when I was working at the Metropolitan Museum, I'm working on little Egyptian artifacts like that. Nothing prepares you for this.
Nearly 37 feet tall.
Yeah, and so
the issue here is we're also dealing with gravity on the bottom.
Yeah.
So the pieces on the top of that surface were less apt to fall off than the pieces on the bottom because there was weight there.
Yeah. So basically, we had all this stuff that was hanging and starting to fall off. So I got in touch with friends of mine over at the Philadelphia Museum of Art who had worked on ceilings where they had exfoliation, nothing like this, but paint layers and so on. And so Sally Malenka, one of the objects conservators there, came up and looked at it and worked with us on a procedure to how to restore it, where literally Peter Gatt, who was working for me, was the primary person involved. We had some other people helping. And what we were doing is like in conservation paintings and so on, where you would actually inject an adhesive and then try and get it to attach.
You're essentially gluing it back.
Yep, gluing it back. But as Maury points out, gravity.
Yeah.
What do you do with the underside stuff?
So you can't exactly flip that over.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I came up with a technique where I was using the sheet magnets, like refrigerator magnet type stuff, but you can buy it in large sheets. And what we would do is we would actually inject adhesive and then put the magnet, because iron, so it actually sticks to the last column. And that's what was holding it in place while the adhesive was setting. And that we had to do that for large swaths of the surface on the bottom, and the top obviously was a little bit easier. So that took a long time just to stabilize everything.
It took a very long time.
Yeah.
Months.
Then having done all of that, we then had all these artifacts that we had to take off and what to do with them. So we took them over to the storage facility in Brooklyn Navy Yards to check and to restore. But then the issue was that a lot of it's ephemeral stuff. So if you put it on display like in a museum, we have restrictions for light levels, things fade and so on. And a lot of the pieces had already faded. Some of the photographs, you could hardly see the colors of anything. And so I was concerned with the fact that even if we put them on again, for display, they're still at risk. So we decided that we would do very, very high quality reproductions of all these things. And then because in conservation, one of our commandments is thou shalt be reversible. And so the idea was if we just tape them or somehow adhere them back on, it's going to be difficult again to take them off. So we not only did the reproductions, but when we put the originals on, having already successfully worked with the sheet magnets gave me the aha moment why don't we actually attach whether it's the original objects to these magnetic sheets, and then that's how we installed
how it's
them.
held on.
And so that's how they're on there now. Yeah. In addition, when it finally came to the museum, we talked about the idea that you also have these reproductions. So the idea was that you would have a certain amount of original material that would be on the column, but also, give it a rest so that you would also have a mix of some reproductions and some that were real, and then kind of rotate them. So therefore, you would minimize the amount of damage that was done. And as I recall, there's a case with some signage in explaining that too. And we felt that it still is authentic enough that when people see the column, they are seeing the real thing. And that was some of the things we did to preserve it until Hurricane Sandy came.
That's another conversation. It's already here at that point. It's not the Hangar 17 chapter. What was interesting about these early years was sort of the growing interest of people in coming out there and seeing what that was. This became a thing that became known and had this extraordinary attraction because of still people, even years after, wrestling with what had happened and wanting to connect with the objects. I mean, Mark, you gave tours of the hangar out there. Maury, I assume you did too.
Many.
What was that like? Who was out there, and what were they looking for?
Go ahead.
I mean, that's a big question. Who was out there? Anybody that could get access to it wanted to. So there were a lot of first responders would come, family members would come, other architects and engineers. And I think part of it goes back to maybe what I had said earlier about seeing is believing, right? I needed to see the site. I needed to really let this get me, right? And so I think a lot of people are coming to the hangar for that experience. There's a big curiosity. What do you save? What's left? What is this really like? And it's hard to describe the experience of the hangar. Part of that for me was that I'd become so accustomed to the chaos of the pile on site. And then to see those same artifacts removed from the site and placed in order, even though I was part of every step and decision of that shift was somehow disturbing, right? It was also peaceful. You mentioned being in the hangar alone, right? It was a very powerful experience. And really, and most of the tours were, 10, 15
Max.
people, right? We didn't take a lot of people in there. So it was always a quiet and contemplative experience. And everyone would connect differently. And most museums, you're not allowed to touch the artifacts, but people would touch them, right? That tactility was important to connect to these artifacts, connect to the event, connect to our emotions, connect to the experience.
Yeah, it was certainly a museum of a kind. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and you also have to remember that during this time where people started coming out to the hangar, there was no museum. As a matter of fact, it wasn't a certainty that the museum was going to get built at all. So there was a lot of interest about what is left, what is this stuff that we hear about that we don't know about. And there were some press reports, and some people came out, and that stimulated more interest. The thing about the hangar was that it wasn't real safe. I mean, it was not designed for people to walk around in. I mean, it was an older building. The floors had kind of settled, so it was challenging. But we did bring, people. Is that for you?
Please silence your phone.
Yeah, right. One of the things that we did fairly early on was to, and you were very helpful with this, both of you, was to call other institutions to ask them what they thought we ought to do with it. So we had the Met, we had the Natural History Museum, we had the Museum of the City of New York, we had Hudson, we had Corning come in. All of these museums had dealt with precious objects that needed work and organization. And they all gave us really, really good pieces of advice. But you know, the most meaningful tour that I did was something, you know, at the end of my time there, and that Jan had set up with a survivor group. And there were about, I don't know, 10 of them. And these were people who had been at the Trade Center and had managed to obviously live and survive. And they came out, and I was there, I think, with Peter Gatt, and we, you know, walked through, and I spent a lot of time talking about what we were doing and why we were doing it, and where the objects were and how we're caring for them. And I got this unbelievable handwritten letter back from a woman about a week later saying, you know, I just want to thank you for taking us through. And you have to, and you should know, this was in 2006 maybe, that I haven't been able to sleep through the night since September 11th. And last night, after you walking through, it wasn't me, it was Peter, but having seen that you're caring for these things, I slept through the night for the first time, which was pretty unbelievable.
Yeah. You know, the demand for it was not just to come to the site, but also there was a lot of steel, and people were already thinking of making memorials. So the process of distributing this material, because to be fair, we, even in our nascent stage at that point, were given access to the materials to make choices for what we would put in the museum.
Right.
Other museums came along to make their requests as well. But even with all of those requests accounted for, there was a lot of material that was still left.
Right.
And the demand for it began to grow as places began to think about how to make memorials. And steel became the iconic element that anyone could identify with from the towers themselves and from the pile of the collapsed materials. So talk a little bit about the distribution of that steel outward.
Well, to be fair, most of the, well, it was clear that you and Jan and others came out and said, we want this, we want this, we want this. And we had long conversations, not only about why it's a good idea or why this may not be a good idea, and then how to care for it in this subterranean space here. But the bulk of the material that was left was distributed after I left the port. Okay. So I'm grateful that the people who followed us and our time there understood the importance of being able to distribute steel, and it was done in pretty short order, like about a year.
Steve, Mark, do you want to come in on that issue of the distribution of the steel?
I was actually gone by the time it started distributing.
No one was here.
Yeah, I was out of the picture at that point. I had moved on to the architecture side, designing the museum. The only piece that left the hangar when I was there was a piece of the North Tower antenna, which went to the museum.
The museum down
in Washington, D.C.
Right.
That was the first piece that we released.
Right.
And I can't talk much about that process other than I felt like I was losing part of my, so you become very attached to these things on a personal level, and it was kind of a milestone for me understanding that this collection, and the collection was obviously never my collection, it was never our collection, it was everybody's collection, right? It's just the way that's just the way it was. But to care for something and then to start seeing it go. Steve, were you around for more of the distribution? You were there.
We were administering it with the Port Authority. Yeah. The decision was made that after sort of, as you were explaining, museums, offered and so on. But as Mark points out, these pieces were big and heavy, right. So very, very few institutions could take them. And meantime, a lot of the firehouse is an example, one pieces. So the Port Authority came up with a plan where people could submit a request for it. It had to be nonprofit organizations with a reasonable claim for why they would want the piece of steel. This would be reviewed by people at the Port Authority. Then the Port Authority would approve the request. And then I and my team that was working for me basically administered out at the hangar. So we had somebody virtually, full-time out there.
Right.
We had a full inventory of everything, what the sizes were. There was estimates about the weights and so on. And we would get these requests. And obviously people didn't know what was there. So we had to sort of come up with something to indicate we had large pieces, we had small pieces, to get into a dialogue with individuals. And the one thing that was kind of unique, certainly for somebody like myself, in conservation, if 5 people want a piece of an artifact, normally we don't cut it up to give it to each of them.
Right.
And so the question was, well, Port Authority was saying, but nobody can handle all that big steel. And these are like people who had a real true desire to do a memorial or something. Right. So the long and short of it is we decided that we would actually, so some of the pieces that you really didn't want to cut because they told such a fantastic story. So we sort of held off and tried to find people that could take that. But otherwise, for a lot of the smaller institutions, that they just wanted a piece of the real thing. And so we started to actually, using Port Authority people, cutting pieces into smaller sections. And basically, that's what we did. We ran the program. And maybe it's just a rationalization because, I'm creating a great conservation sin here. But an artifact sitting in a hangar doesn't have any meaning for anybody. It's just sitting there. Right. For what purpose? And the piece was already damaged. And to cut a piece and give it to a fire department who actually had people who in the firehouse who lost their lives, it still has that spiritual quality. And so we felt that that was serving the greater purpose, and that's basically how we did it. And in the end, we gave everything away.
Right. I should
Hundreds of pieces of steel, I just want to add. This went very, very widely
and
around the world. Yeah.
Like what Maury was just explaining that letter, it's the same thing. It was so touching because some people would just come with a pickup truck. Others would come with like a whole entourage.
Yeah.
But it was a very ceremonial thing. Right. It wasn't just here it is, sign off.
I should clarify my answer a little bit. We started to get requests for steel really early, but we didn't have the ability or really the permission to distribute stuff. So we kept files of people who had asked. There were lots of them.
And it still amazes me now. Sometimes I'll pass by and didn't even know where a piece went, don't remember.
Yeah.
And I see this rusted thing. It's like, oh my gosh.
I've come across steel now and again in very unexpected places. Yeah.
So that's how the program happened.
Yeah. Let's see if we have a question or two from the audience. Hang on one second. We're going to get you a mic if you are called on. Gentleman there, first hand up. Wait for your microphone.
What was involved in the process of determining ownership of the objects?
I'm probably not the person to ask, but I know that there were some lengthy negotiations back and forth with both the insurance companies and the leaseholder, and it was resolved to everybody's satisfaction. I think there was a conversation with the insurance companies saying, well, I think that we own this. And then there was a kind of a determination, okay, well, what are you going to value it as? I mean, if you value it as raw steel, it's going to cost probably $1 a cubic foot. But if it's a precious object, what are you going to value it at? Infinity? So we said, well, if you value it really high, we're happy to send you the bill for everything that we've spent, millions of dollars that we've spent taking care of it. And they backed off that pretty fast.
Other question. Gentleman there.
Thank you. I'm going to break a rule of my own, which is when people want to ask a question, don't make a statement. This is more like a statement, but there's a question in it. I, on September 11, was at home 10 blocks north of here, and I had to leave where I lived and did so for a period of time. I was able to go upstate. And chronologies got me very screwed up. One of the most haunting memories I have in the aftermath of September 11 is these huge flatbed trucks that would drive directly under my windows. And I now realize from listening to you gentlemen speak that they were headed to the hangar with steel on each one of them. What is confusing me in all of that is, when did that happen? I was away probably until October something, and then I returned to the city, and I think it was then that at home I would hear and feel these huge trucks driving under the windows of my apartment and heading to, now I know, Hangar 17. For how long did that go on? It sort of, did it start?
Chronology is a funny thing.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I can answer that. I mean, I think as the site started to clear, it became safer to remove these objects. You remember that iconic photograph of like the 12 stories of the Trade Center that were left after the collapse of Tower 1. I really wanted to save that whole thing, but we couldn't because it was too dangerous. So I think as the site started to get clearer, they were able to put these things on flatbeds and move them. You should also know that the vast majority of this steel was cut up and put on barges and sent over to New Jersey, where it was put on boats to go wherever, to melt down, to make other stuff.
Do you think I'm right in my assumption that the trucks driving by under my windows were heading to JFK?
Of course you're right. No, seriously, I'm sure you're right.
Another question. Right there.
Just out of curiosity, I'd read somewhere that the Navy took some of the steel in order to construct a battleship. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think that's right.
That is right.
I think that they used it for ballast in one of their boats. They didn't take this. I'm sorry.
I can fill in some of the gaps.
Good.
Hang on a minute, John. We'll get you a mic.
So the Navy took 14 tons of steel that they used for the bow pulpit of the U.S. New Yorker, that was constructed after 9/11 and named in recognition of the three agencies: the Port Authority Police Department, the New York City Police Department, and the New York City Fire Department. And to the answer to the gentleman over there about the route, steel and other components were actually moved over 9 months from the second, third week in September until the closing ceremony that took place on May 30th, when we moved the
Last column.
last column to the hangar. And the routes were selected because you got to understand is that a lot of the steel that was transported from the site to the hangar was overweight and over width. So there was prescribed routes that we had to take there to get it out of the city. Because initially there was some thought about bringing it to New Jersey, but we would have had to taken it through a tunnel, and with the fulcrum point, we didn't think it would be able to clear.
Right.
So that's how we wound up taking it actually over the Williamsburg Bridge and out to the hangar. So.
Yeah. I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the steel that went to the Navy Yard did not come from the hangar.
No.
It went directly from the site.
To your earlier point there, when we were doing the rescue recovery operation there, the trucking operation was not very efficient in that, the trucks had to transport the steel, so they either went through Brooklyn over the Verrazano Bridge, or they went through the Holland Tunnel to the Turnpike to the landfill in Staten Island. So realizing the inefficiencies of that there, we brought in barges adjacent to Stuyvesant High School, where then the steel would be loaded on these large dump trucks, brought to the barges and loaded onto the barges, and then transported to the hangar, to the site in Staten Island. And that's where the steel for the Navy ship was received from.
Yeah, and even if being at the being at the World Trade Center site was incredibly humbling and moving, being at the hangar was really moving. Being at Fresh Kills was unbelievable. And to see the tents where they were going through every single object was really, and you spent time out there.
Yeah.
You spent a lot of time out there. That was really something.
We're going to close soon, but I want to ask each of you just quickly, is there, and Maury may have done this with the letter he described, but you all went through so much in relation to your pieces of this extraordinary project. Is there one thing that sticks in your mind from that time, or something you would want to share about what you walked away with when this was all done for you?
So, let's see, there's so much. First and foremost, I would say one of the most often asked questions was, what artifact? As I explain what I'm doing, I'm saving artifacts that tell a story. I'm saving artifacts that will mean something to this generation, to the next generation. And the question would always turn around and say, well, what's the artifact that means the most to you? And for me, it was never the artifacts. And so what I took away from the experience was, and it was the answer to that question, which it wasn't the artifacts, it was the people that I met, the community, the way we came together. It was the Red Cross worker that offered to wash my boots after a 14-hour day on the site. It was the hot meal that was given to me when we were freezing and out there doing our thing. So it was really about that community and that sense that, even in kind of the worst possible scenario that we could have never imagined, we came together. So that for me is my big takeaway, and hopefully something that resonates through the museum, that we can come together and we can be better. We can be better to each other. We should be better to each other. We can.
Steve?
The one thought that comes to mind is, I remember when we were building the enclosures, and it was Port Authority team that was doing the work. So one of the guys I was friendly with, and so he was saying that, he admired the work we're doing, trying to preserve and so on. And what's the purpose? And I was explaining that what we're trying to do is take these pieces and sort of arrest them just the way they are, so it's as close to the event as possible, and it's so that the future generations can decide what they want about the meaning of 9/11, but it'll be based on the real thing, not on anything that's tarted up. And so he actually said to me, I don't understand. Why is anybody going to change their mind? But we know that history does that. And so that's really the code, I think, of conservation in general, is that we shouldn't impose our will on the piece. We should allow the piece to talk, not for our generation, but for everybody.
Thank you. Maury, last word.
I think of three things. First of all, this activity is the most important thing I'll do in my life. The second thing is the respect that I had for Mark and Steve and Jan and you during this process was unbelievable. And the third, it's a very personal thing. I took my dad out there, and he happened to be in the Capitol when it was evacuated that day. And he didn't have a clue what the hell I was doing. And I took him there, and he understood. And it was very meaningful for me personally.
Well, any of us who've been to the museum, spent time here, have been the beneficiaries of what I can tell you with certainty was this extraordinary effort, really unprecedented. And the amount of devotion and attention which is expressed through these objects is really the result of the work of these three gentlemen and many others who were there and were taking part in what Mark describes, I think, very, very accurately as part of the collective response to 9/11. So I'm going to make the last push for you, because the story is told in this book. Jan has an essay actually in there. I won't mention mine, but there are a number of really interesting essays in here. Also, an essay about the history of the hangar. And the photos that were taken are really a way of capturing what was. And I say that deliberately because that moment that these gentlemen were so intimately involved with is gone. And really the only record is here between the covers of this book. So on that commercial note, I'm going to ask you to join me in thanking Amory Houghton, Mark Wagner, and Steve.